How are you guys doing? Today is Friday, January 15th, 2021, out here in this quarantine. I'm James Sims, and for this episode of The Elite, I'm going to do an individual profile on Drew Brees, who today turns 42, and with this episode, I'm just going to bring up all the accolades and everything that he's accomplished up until this date. This may be his final season and as an NFL player before his game in a couple of days against the Buccaneers, which could possibly be his last one. I'm going to give an elite profile for Drew Brees, saying that going into 2021, he is an elite quarterback, and if this game will be his last, I do think that Drew Brees will be one of the best quarterbacks that I have seen in my lifetime. So, just to give you a little bit of background, if you're not familiar with Drew Brees, he's a 6-foot quarterback from Austin, Texas, and in high school he was good enough to get recruited to go to Purdue. And in his 1997 season at Purdue, he would play 8 games, and he would probably complete about 19 of his 43 passes, throwing for 232 yards. That was his freshman season. He would bounce back his sophomore season, and in 1998, he would play 13 games for Purdue in a season where they would finish 9-4 and win the Alamo Bowl, ranked in the top 25. Drew Brees would go on to be named the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year after completing 63% of his passes, throwing for 3,900 yards, almost 4,000 yards, again with 40 touchdowns, with 39 passing touchdowns against 20 interceptions. In 1999, in his junior season, in 12 games, he would complete 61% of his passes for 3,900 yards, 25 touchdowns, and 12 picks. In a season where they would finish 7-5 and lose in the Outback Bowl. And they were just barely ranked as well in 1999. He wouldn't win Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year in 1999, but he would in 2000 in his senior season, where under Joe Tiller, and Joe Tiller's 4th season, he would help the team go 8-4. They would lose in the Rose Bowl after being ranked 13th overall. But in this season, Drew Brees would complete 60% of his passes, throwing for 3,600 yards and 26 touchdowns against 12 picks. He would be named the Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year, and then following that, he's shown that he was a good enough prospect to be taken with the 32nd overall pick in the NFL draft. He was taken by the then San Diego Chargers in 2001. And then following that, he would make his first career start in 2001 when he was 22, or he would make a start. He would sub in for a game and then throw for 200 yards and a touchdown, but he wouldn't get fully started until 2002. And in 2002, he would start all 16 games in a season where the San Diego Chargers would finish 8-8. And this would be Marty Schottenheimer's first season. That's how long ago the season was. And this season he finished with an 8-8 record, throwing for 3,284 yards with 17 touchdowns against 16 interceptions. While helping the Los Angeles Chargers finish they would finish with the 3rd best record in the AFC West. Not much will come out of that season. But in his second season starting in 2003, in his age 24 season in San Diego, Drew Brees would start 11 games in a season where the San Diego Chargers would finish 4-12 under Marty Schottenheimer. And this would be when Drew Brees would end up with a shoulder injury, and they weren't sure what to do with Drew Brees, and he had to eventually come back the next year all better. And in 2014, his age 25 season, he would start 15 of the games that he played in, all 15 of those games in a season where they would finish with a 12-4 record, the best record in the AFC West, the first time that Drew Brees made the playoffs in the NFL. Where Marty Schottenheimer won Coach of the Year and Drew Brees won Comeback Player of the Year coming off of his injury. And he was named to a Pro Bowl for the first time in his career. And this season he would complete 65.5% of his passes. The second time in his career he completed 60% of his passes, second to his first season. He would throw for 3,200 yards, 27 touchdowns, the first time he threw for over 20 touchdowns in a season. He threw for 7 interceptions, first time he threw under 15 in an extended season. And at the same time, he was able to get the Chargers to the playoffs, where they eventually lost to the Jets in overtime by 3. That was when they had LaDainian Tomlinson at running back. And then in 2005, moving into his next season, Drew Brees in his age 26 season would start all 16 games in a season where the San Diego Chargers would finish 9-7 with the third best record in the AFC West, in a year where Sean Merriman won Defensive Rookie of the Year. Once again, that's how old Drew Brees is. In this season, Drew Brees would complete 64.6% of his passes. The third time in his career, he completed 60%. He threw for 3,500 yards on the season. That would be the most he'd thrown in a season in his career up until that point. He threw for 24 touchdowns. The second time in his career, he threw for over 20. He threw 15 interceptions. The third time in his career, he threw 15 in a season. And that season, the San Diego Chargers, I keep getting that mixed up. The San Diego Chargers would miss the playoffs that year, and that would be Drew Brees' final year in San Diego, as they had drafted Phillip Rivers to be his replacement. Because remember, that's how old Drew Brees is. So going to Drew Brees' first season in 2006, and this would come in the height or right after Hurricane Katrina hit. So in Drew Brees' first season, he won Walter Payton Man of the Year in 2006, and he went on to be one of the best players in the NFL, showing that this is the year that he became the franchise quarterback for the New Orleans Saints. So in 2006, Drew Brees would start all 16 games in a season where the Saints would finish 10-6 with the best record in the NFC South, the first time they made the playoffs since 2000. So that's a 5-year playoff drought. So that Drew Brees brought them out of. In this season, in his age 27 season, he would complete 64% of his passes. This would be the fourth time he'd done this in his career. He'd lead the league in passing yards for the first time in his career, throwing for 4,418 yards. The first time the quarterback has eclipsed 44,000 in his career. He threw for 26 touchdowns. The third time in his career, he threw for 20 touchdowns. And he threw for 11 interceptions, the second lowest he'd ever have in a full season in his career. And getting the Saints to the playoffs, they would beat the Eagles in the divisional playoffs, but they would lose in the NFC Championship to the Chicago Bears, who would eventually lose to the Indianapolis Colts. But Drew Brees would go on to make his second Pro Bowl. He would make the NFL first team for the only time in his career. This would be the first of the 7 times he would be named the passing yards leader in the NFL. And Drew Brees was just getting started as one of the league's best players. So jumping into 2007, in his age 28 season, Drew Brees would start all 16 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints would finish with a 7-9 record and miss the playoffs. This would be, of course, Drew Brees' second year in New Orleans, and just not a lot going for them, but he was able to do what he could. And in this season, he was able to complete 67% of his passes, 67.5, the highest completion percentage he'd have in a season in his career, while he led the league in completions and pass attempts for the first time in his career. He threw for 28 touchdowns, the most touchdowns he'd ever throw in his career. He also threw 18 interceptions, the most interceptions he'd ever thrown in his career, while also leading the league in sack percentage for the first time in his career as well. And they went on to miss the playoffs, but of course Drew Brees was making a run for the passing yards record, because this would be the second time in his career he had thrown for 4,400 yards in a season, throwing for 5 more than the season in which he led the league in passing yards. So this jumps into his 2008 season, and in 2008, in Drew Brees' age 29 season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the Saints would finish 8-8 with the 4th best record in the NFC South. He would win the Offensive Player of the Year despite finishing on the worst team in his own division. He would go on to lead the league in passing completions and attempts for the second straight year, completing 65% of his passes. This would be the third time in his career he had done so, throwing for 5,069 yards. He would lead the league in passing yards, and this would be the first time Drew Brees passed for 5,000 yards. He led the league in passing touchdowns with 34. This would be the first time he led the league in passing touchdowns and the first time he'd ever thrown for 30 touchdowns in a season. He threw for 17 interceptions, the second time he'd ever thrown so many interceptions in a season, leading the league in yards per game as well. And once they made it they completely missed the playoffs in 2008. But the next year he would bounce back, and this is Drew Brees' career up before he won his first championship. And I just spoiled it. Going into 2009 in Drew Brees' age 30 season, he would start 15 regular season games in a season where the New Orleans Saints would finish 13-3 with the best record in the NFC South. The second time they'd made the playoffs in Drew Brees' first 4 seasons of being there. And in that season, Drew Brees would complete 70.6% of his passes. This would be the first time he led the league in completion percentage. This would be the first time Drew Brees had completed 70% of his passes in an NFL season. He would throw for 4,388 yards. This would be the 4th season in a row he would throw for 4,000 yards. He threw for 34 touchdowns. The second season in a row, he threw for 34 touchdowns. And the second straight season, he led the league in passing yards, led the league in touchdown percentage for the first time in his career. He also threw it against 11 interceptions, tied with 2006 for the second least amount of interceptions he'd thrown in his career up until that point. He led the league in QBR and passing rating as well. Once he made it to the playoffs, they went on to beat the Arizona Cardinals 45-14 in the wild card. They earned the divisional playoffs, They beat the Vikings in overtime in the NFC Championship with Brett Favre as their starting quarterback, and they ended up beating the Indianapolis Colts led by Peyton Manning 31-17. Drew Brees would win the Super Bowl MVP. Sean Payton would win his first and only Super Bowl championship, and Drew Brees has that would be Drew Brees' only Super Bowl championship that he had won for himself in 2009, which was literally 12 years ago, and Drew Brees has continued to build his legacy up until now. Up until 2010, Drew Brees had never been a champion, but through 2010 and for the last decade, Drew Brees has been a champion, continuing to inflict his will over the rest of the league. And also in 2009, this would be the second straight year he made the All NFL second team. This would be the 4th Pro Bowl he had made in his career, in addition to his 3rd playoff season. Second time he'd been an NFL pass touchdown leader as well. This would be the first, and he would start his streak in which he would throw the most consecutive games with a touchdown pass as well. And this would all lead into 2010. So following his Super Bowl championship season in which he was named to the Pro Bowl for his 4th time in his career, in his age 31 season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints would finish with an 11-5 record, which would be the second best record in the NFC South. And in this season, Drew Brees would complete 68.1% of his passes. This would be the third time he completed at least 67% of his passes. This would be the 4th he completed 65. This would be the second time he led the league in completion percentage in the league. He threw for 4,620 yards. This would be the second time he'd eclipsed 4,500 yards in his career. He threw for 33 touchdowns. The 3rd time in his career he threw for 30 touchdowns in a season. He threw 22 interceptions, the most interceptions he'd throw in a season in his career. And at the same time, he was able to get the New Orleans Saints to the playoffs. And once they made it to the playoffs, they lost to the Seattle Seahawks in the wild card 41-36. I believe that was the Marshawn Lynch game. I might not be completely sure. I think it was that season, but this was following their championship season, and Drew Brees was still coming off of an amazing season. But in this year, he would be named to the Pro Bowl for the 5th time in his career. And he was the second time he was the completion passing yards leader as well. And Drew Brees was just continuing to compete at such a high level. This would lead into his 2011 season, which would be his age 32 season. He would start all 16 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints would finish with the best record in the NFC South. They would make the playoffs for the 3rd consecutive season and the 4th time in his first 6 seasons being in New Orleans. And in this season, Drew Brees would complete 71.2% of his passes. This would be the highest completion percentage he'd have in his career. The 3rd time in a row, he'd lead the NFL in completion percentage. He led the league in completions for the 3rd time in his career. He threw for 5,476 yards, the most passing yards any quarterback has thrown in any season in NFL history. He threw that with 46 passing touchdowns, the most touchdowns he's ever thrown in a season, and the first time he'd ever thrown for 40 touchdowns in a season against 14 interceptions. He threw for 342.3 yards per game in a 16-game season, which is an NFL record. He would take this on into the playoffs, where the New Orleans Saints would beat the Lions in the wild card, and then they would lose to the San Francisco 49ers in the divisional round, where the San Francisco 49ers went to the Super Bowl and eventually lost with Colin Kaepernick as their quarterback. Drew Brees was named the Offensive Player of the Year for the second time in his career. He was the completion percentage leader for the third time in his career. He was named to his 6th ever Pro Bowl. He was named to the All-NFL second team for the second time in his career. And then following 2011, Sean Payton was hit with his coaching suspension. And in the year where he had to share Aaron Kromer and Joe Vitt as head coaches in 2012, during his age 33 season, he would start all 16 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints would finish 7-9 with the third best record in the NFC South. And in this season, Drew Brees would complete 63% of his passes. This would be the lowest he'd have in his career since 2003. But, I mean, he was still completing 62% of them. He threw for 5,177 yards. This would be the 4th time he led the league in passing yards. And this would be the 3rd time he threw for 5,000 yards in his career, where he established the name for himself, Mr. 5K, I'm sorry. He threw for 43 passing touchdowns. This would be the 2nd and final time in his career he threw for 40 touchdowns in a season. He led the league in passing interceptions for the only time in his career, throwing for 19 of them. And he led the league in yards per game. And in the season, they wouldn't make the playoffs. But Drew Brees would go on to make the Pro Bowl for the 7th time in his career. He was the passing touchdown leader for the final time in his career as well. And going into his age 34 season in 2013, Drew Brees would start all 16 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints finished with an 11-5 record, with the 2nd best record in the NFC South. In this season, Drew Brees would go on to make his 6th Pro Bowl in a row and his 8th total. And he would complete 68.6% of his passes. This would be the 4th time he completed 68% of his passes in a 5-year span. He threw for 5,162 yards. This would be the 4th time in his career he threw for 5,000 yards. This would be the 1st time he threw for 5,000 yards and didn't lead the league in passing. He threw for 39 touchdowns. This would be the 3rd time in his career he'd thrown that many touchdowns in a season. He threw for 12 interceptions, which is the least he's had in a season since 2009. And then he also went on to lead the Saints to the playoffs, where they would eventually beat the Eagles in the wild card, and they would lose in the divisional round to the Seahawks when the Seahawks were at the top of their game. But, of course, Drew Brees was just a constant in the playoffs and, of course, in the Pro Bowl as well. And this would lead to 2014, his age 35 season, where he would start all 16 games in a season where the Saints would finish with a 7-9 record. Drew Brees, and they completely missed the playoffs, but Drew Brees would make the Pro Bowl for the 7th consecutive time in his career. That would be his longest streak of making Pro Bowls. He would lead the league in passing completions for the 4th time in his career. He'd lead the league in passing attempts for the 3rd time in his career. He completed 69.2% of his passes, the 3rd highest he'd have in his career up until that point. And up until then, that might have been, that was yet another time he finished with at least 65% of his completed 65% of his passes. He led the league with 4,952 passes. This would be the 5th time in his career he led the league in passing yards. He threw for 33 touchdowns. This would be the 7th year in a row that he would throw for at least 30 touchdowns in a season. He threw for 17 picks, the most he'd have since since 2012. And he led the league in yards per game for the 5th time in his career as he played all 16 games. And in that season, like I said, he'll be named a Pro Bowler for the 9th time in his career, even though the Saints completely missed the playoffs. This would lead into his 2015 season. And in his age 36 season, he would start all 15 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints finished with a 7-9 record for the second consecutive year. Of course, they were definitely lacking on defense, but Drew Brees was holding his own on the offensive end. He completed 68.3% of his passes. This would be the third season in a row in which he completed 68% of his passes. He threw for 4,870 yards. This would be yet another season since this would complete the streak since 2006 in which he's thrown for over 4,000 yards. He threw for 32 touchdowns. Yet another season in which he threw for 30 touchdowns in a season against 11 interceptions. And in this season, they would completely miss the playoffs, and Drew Brees wouldn't be named a Pro Bowler, but he was still one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, if not the best. This would lead into his 2016 season, where he would start all 16 games in a season in his age 37 season, where the New Orleans Saints would finish with a 7-9 record for the third season in a row and miss the playoffs. And in this season, Drew Brees would be named a Pro Bowler for the 10th time in his career, leading the league in passing completions for the 5th time in his career. He led the league in passing attempts for the 4th time in his career. He led the league in passing yards for the 7th and final time in his career, but for the 3rd time in a row at this point, throwing for 5,208 yards. This would be the 5th and final time, at least to date, that he has thrown for 5,000 passing yards in a season. He threw for 37 touchdown passes, which up until this point is the 4th most he'd ever thrown in a season. And yet another season on the streak since 2008. So that would be the 9th season in a row in which he threw for 30 touchdown passes in a season against 15 interceptions, which is yet another season where he threw a double-digit amount of interceptions. He's had a streak since 2005. That would be the 12th season in a row. And he had the longest pass in the NFL for that season, the only time that he'd ever do that. And leading after that, the New Orleans Saints have not missed the playoffs since 2016. Leading into 2017, in his age 38 season, Drew Brees would start all 16 games in a season where the Saints would finish with an 11-5 record. He would be named to the Pro Bowl for the 11th time in his career while completing 72% of his passes. The second time in his career he completed second season in a row in which he completed 70% of his passes. This would be the 4th time in his career in which he did so, and this would be the 4th time in his career in which he led this league in completion percentage. He threw for 4,334 yards that season. That would be the last time he'd ever thrown for 4,000 yards in a season. This would be the 12th and final season that in a row in which Drew Brees had thrown for at least 4,000 yards in a season. He threw for 23 touchdowns and he threw for 8 interceptions. The first time he'd have single-digit interceptions in a season since 2004, which of course would break a 12-year streak of doing so. And he would lead the New Orleans Saints to the playoffs. So they would beat the Panthers in the wild card, and then they would lose to the Minnesota Vikings on a last-second play. But this would be the first time they lost, and this would be the year that Alvin Kamara won the Offensive Rookie of the Year, while Marshawn Lattimore won the Defensive Rookie of the Year. So this would lead once again into Drew Brees' 2018 season, his age 39 season, and his 12th Pro Bowl season. He would start all 15 games in a season where the New Orleans Saints would finish with a 13-3 record, which would be the second year in a row they finished with the best record in the NFC South. In this season, the Drew Brees would complete 74.4% of his passes, the NFL record for the highest completion percentage in one single season, set by Drew Brees. This would be the 5th time he led the league in completion percentage, and this would be the 5th time he had completed 70% of his passes in a season. He threw for 3,992 yards, breaking his 12-season streak of 4,000 yards in a season. He threw for 32 touchdowns, yet another season in which he had thrown for 30 touchdowns. It would be the 10th season he'd thrown for at least 32 passing touchdowns, averaging 2 touchdowns a game for the season. He threw it against 5 interceptions, the second lowest amount of interceptions he'd ever have as a starting quarterback. And in the playoffs, the New Orleans Saints would beat the Eagles, who had won the previous Super Bowl, and they would go on to lose to the Rams in the NFC Championship before the Rams lost to the Patriots in the Super Bowl. So that's what happened in 2018. This would lead into 2019, which would be Drew Brees' age 40 season. And even though he was injured for a bit, he would start 11 games and he would finish with an 8-3 record in a season where the Saints would finish with a 13-3 record, which would give him the best record in the NFC South for the third year in a row. And in the season, Drew Brees would complete 74.3% of his passes. This would be the sixth time in his career which he led the league in completion percentage, and the sixth and final time, or like the sixth and most recent time he had led the league in completion percentage, and he almost done it this year. He threw for 2,979 yards. This would be the first time since 2003 in which he didn't throw for at least 3,000 yards in a season. He threw for 27 touchdowns, and he threw that against 4 interceptions, which is the best touchdown to interception ratio he had ever had in the league. 4 interceptions is the lowest amount of interceptions he's ever had as a starting quarterback. He achieved in his age 40 season. And once they made it to the playoffs, he helped the Saints ended up losing in the playoffs to the Vikings in overtime on a last-second play. And this would be Drew Brees' 13th time that he had reached the NFL Pro Bowl. And Michael Thomas was the Offensive Player of the Year after he had the most receptions in an NFL season. And of course, Drew Brees is somewhat responsible for that incredible feat that Michael Thomas accomplished. And last but not least, we get into 2020, where we currently sit with Drew Brees. He's had a very long and illustrious NFL career, and it's still continuing as of right now. Where he currently stands, Drew Brees was not named a Pro Bowler this year because he had a punctured lung in the middle of the season, and Taysom Hill had to start a couple of games. So he would start 12 games and finish with a 9-3 record in a season where the New Orleans Saints finished 12-4 with the best record in the NFC South for the 4th year in a row with Drew Brees being there. And since he's taken over as starting quarterback of the New Orleans Saints, this is the 9th time that he's made the playoffs with the New Orleans Saints. And in this season, he would complete 70.5% of his passes. This would be the 7th time in his career that he would complete at least 70% of his passes, a feat that nobody has ever done in the history of the game. He had thrown for 2,942 yards, the second time in his career the second time in a row he'd thrown under 3,000 yards in a season. He threw for 24 touchdowns against 6 picks. The 6 picks is the third lowest amount of interceptions he'd ever have in a season in 24. This would be yet another time that he would average at least he would finish with at least 24 touchdowns on the season. And as of right now, where these Saints currently sit, the New Orleans Saints did beat the Chicago Bears on Sunday, and going into the game against their Buccaneers in a couple of days against other GOATed quarterback Tom Brady, Drew Brees has accomplished a lot leading up till today, his 42nd birthday. And looking back on everything that he's accomplished, I mean, he's taken up 2 pages on just what he's done in terms of being elite. He stands out as a player among many because his career didn't start off incredibly well in San Diego. He had to pick it back up in New Orleans, and he got there right when Hurricane Katrina hit. He eventually became not only the franchise quarterback, but he became one of the greatest quarterbacks that had ever played the game. He holds NFL records in so many different ways. He has single games, single season, and he has career records that will carry on at least until the next player breaks them. He has led the league in completion percentage 6 times. He's led the league in passing touchdowns 4 times. He's led the league in pass yards 7 times. He's made it to the playoffs 10 times. That is a decade's worth of playoff seasons. He's made it to the Pro Bowl 13 times. His Pro Bowl career is a teenager in high school virtually. He's been named to the NFL first team in 2006. He is a Super Bowl champ, a Super Bowl MVP, a 2-time NFL Offensive Player of the Year following the time that he was a 2-time Big Ten Offensive Player of the Year. He's completed 65% of his passes, which is an elite feat to accomplish up until now. He's done it 14 times. He's completed 70% of his passes, which is unheard of. He's done it 7 times, and he's done it in the last 5 years. He's completed 74% of his passes twice, and he did it like the last 2 years. And had he played this year and was completely healthy, he probably would have done it this year. He had thrown for 4,500 yards 8 times, including a 7-year stretch from 2010 to 2016. He had thrown for 5,000 passing yards 5 times, which a feat no other quarterback has done, I don't think, more than once or more than twice at the very most. He has the most career NFL passing yards with 80,358 at the moment. He has 7,142 career NFL pass completions in the regular season. He has the second most career passing touchdowns all time to Tom Brady by about 10 touchdowns. He's the most active, he's done the most interceptions of all active quarterbacks. He's done the 12th most all time. He has the highest career completion percentage at 67.7%. And just the fact that he's been able to do so, and he's still playing football in a couple of days, it just shows as to how remarkable Drew Brees is, and shows why he is the first GOAT profile that I am making for the 2021 year. I hope all is well. And if this upcoming game is Drew Brees' last year, or this is Drew Brees' last game, I want to say that Drew Brees played an amazing career. And if he does play another season, I definitely look forward to watching Drew Brees strap up the helmet for yet another game of NFL football. With that said, I want to thank everyone once again for listening to all 31 minutes of my piece. I hope all is well, and hopefully Drew Brees has more to add to this profile. And I will catch up with you tomorrow as I do a profile on Tre'Davious White, who is currently a 25-year-old cornerback playing for the Buffalo Bills. With that said, I hope all is well. I want to thank you guys once again for listening to all 30 and a half minutes of my piece. And peace out. I'll catch you tomorrow.